In this video, we'll dive into the unraveling of Vladimir Putin's grip on power as the war in Ukraine drags on. What began as a confident display of Russian dominance has turned into a chaotic struggle, with cracks forming in both Putin's political control and military strategy. From surprising admissions of hardship to growing discontent within Russia, we'll explore how the war is impacting the country and whether Putin's reign is in jeopardy. Vladimir Putin's grip on power has been an enduring one, and for over 2 decades, he has navigated both domestic and international challenges with an iron fist. Yet the ongoing war in Ukraine has exposed a series of vulnerabilities, both politically and militarily, that few anticipated seeing during his reign. In recent months, the narrative has shifted from the steady, controlled messaging of a powerful, confident Russia to an increasingly chaotic and defensive Putin, struggling to maintain control over the country he has long dominated. This unraveling took a surprising turn when Putin recently admitted on Russian national television that the country was suffering as a result of the war he initiated. Let's break down what this means in the broader context of Russian politics, the conflict in Ukraine, and the increasing discontent brewing within Russia itself. Putin's admission wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark. It was part of a larger conversation he had in front of an audience during a Q&A session with children in Siberia. What started out as a carefully orchestrated media event, likely intended to paint the Russian president in a favorable, paternalistic light, turned into something much more revealing when a young girl innocently asked him a question that caught him off guard. Her father, she said, was fighting for the Russian army, and she simply wanted to know when this special military operation would be over. For Putin, this was not a question he was prepared to answer. The little girl was not asking how much Putin sleeps at night or how hard he works. Softball questions he might have expected, but something far more personal, reflecting the true concerns of Russian citizens who are beginning to grow weary of a war that is exacting a heavy toll on both lives and livelihoods. Instead of delivering one of his typically strong, confident answers, Putin admitted that Russians are indeed suffering. This admission is shocking for a man who has gone to great lengths to portray the war as a noble and necessary cause, one that Russia would undoubtedly win. But the cracks are showing. Even in controlled environments like national television broadcasts, Putin can no longer completely shield himself from the realities of the war. Russians are starting to ask difficult questions, and as these questions grow louder, so too does the pressure on Putin's administration. Following his admission, Putin reverted to his usual rhetoric, blaming Ukraine, NATO, and the West for the conflict. He reiterated that Russia had no choice but to launch this special military operation due to provocations from Ukraine, a coup in Kiev, and NATO's supposed encroachment on Russia's borders. He claimed that Ukraine had become an anti-Russian state and accused the West of turning Ukraine into a military base against Russia. This narrative, while consistent with what he has been saying since the conflict began in 2022, is beginning to wear thin, both domestically and internationally. Many Russians are no longer buying into the idea that this war was unavoidable or justifiable. For them, the mounting casualties, economic hardships, and growing isolation from the international community are simply too high a price to pay for a conflict that many did not want in the first place. In his statements, Putin went even further by accusing Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky of prolonging the war for his own political gain. According to Putin, Zelensky is refusing to hold presidential elections in Ukraine, using martial law as an excuse to avoid facing the electorate. Putin claimed that Zelensky is afraid of losing power, which is why he is supposedly prolonging the conflict. This attempt to shift blame onto Zelensky reveals Putin's growing frustration with the war's progress. For over a year, he has sought to portray Ukraine as the aggressor and himself as the defender of Russian interests. But with each passing month, it becomes clearer that Russia is not achieving the swift victory it had initially envisioned. Instead, the war has dragged on, with heavy losses on both sides and no end in sight. By accusing Zelensky of refusing to end the war, Putin is attempting to deflect attention from his own failure to achieve his military objectives. What makes this situation even more precarious for Putin is the fact that opposition to the war is not just coming from outside Russia, but from within. In recent months, several prominent Russian oligarchs and military figures have openly criticized Putin's handling of the conflict. This is highly unusual in a country where dissent is often met with swift and severe punishment. One such figure, a mercenary leader akin to the infamous Yevgeny Prigozhin, has called for a mutiny against Putin, demanding that the Russian military overthrow him. This level of dissent from within the ranks of Russia's military and oligarchy is unprecedented. Putin's control over the country has always relied on a delicate balance of power between the military, the oligarchs, and his own security apparatus. If these factions start turning against him, his hold on power could be in serious jeopardy. And it's not just the mercenary leaders who are speaking out. Other oligarchs and political figures have also begun to voice their concerns, calling for an end to the war and criticizing Putin's leadership. One particularly notable instance involved an inner circle ally of Putin who was demoted after making critical comments about the war. While this ally did not go so far as to call for Putin's removal, his demotion signals that even those closest to Putin are not immune from the growing dissatisfaction. One of the major issues exacerbating this internal dissent is the widespread corruption within Putin's government. Reports have emerged that millions of dollars intended for fortifying Russia's borders were siphoned off by corrupt officials, leaving the country vulnerable to Ukrainian advances. This revelation has only fueled the growing disillusionment among the Russian populace, who are already struggling with the economic fallout from the war. In one particularly damning example, Ukraine managed to breach Russian defenses with relative ease, exposing just how ill-prepared the Russian military is despite the billions of rubles supposedly spent on fortifications. Ukrainian soldiers crossed into Russian territory, capturing key positions and even releasing footage of their successful incursion. This humiliating defeat for Russia has further eroded confidence in Putin's leadership, both within the military and among the general public. While Putin still maintains tight control over Russian state media, the reality of the war is becoming harder to hide. Over 120,000 people have been evacuated from key regions like Kherson and Belgorod, and these displaced citizens are sharing their stories. Their first-hand accounts of the war's devastation are beginning to leak into Russian society, despite the Kremlin's best efforts to suppress them. This poses a serious problem for Putin. As more and more Russians hear these stories, they will begin to question the official narrative being fed to them by state-controlled media. And as the war drags on, the Kremlin's ability to control the flow of information will only weaken, potentially leading to greater unrest. Given the rising levels of dissent, corruption, and military failures, it's not far-fetched to imagine that Putin's days in power may be numbered. Some have even speculated that a coup could be in the works. While it's too early to say for certain, the possibility of an internal power struggle is growing. If a significant portion of the military or oligarchy were to turn against Putin, he could face a mutiny or even be forcibly removed from power. This would not be the first time a Russian leader has been overthrown in the face of military defeat and public discontent. The fall of the Soviet Union, which Putin witnessed firsthand, is a prime example of how quickly a seemingly unassailable regime can crumble when faced with internal opposition and external pressure. Economically, Russia is also feeling the strain. While the Russian economy has shown some signs of growth, largely due to war spending and continued energy exports to China and India, the long-term outlook is bleak. The war is consuming vast amounts of resources, and Russia's ability to sustain its economy through military spending is limited. Without the revenue from its energy exports, which have been hit hard by Western sanctions, Russia's economy would likely be in a much worse position. Even with these revenues, however, the costs of the war are beginning to outweigh the benefits. Putin is well aware of this. He lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union and knows that economic instability can quickly lead to political unrest. This is why he has been pushing hard to secure new deals, such as the pipeline agreement with Mongolia, in an attempt to keep Russia's economy afloat. But these deals may not be enough to stave off the long-term economic consequences of the war. Vladimir Putin has long prided himself on being a strong, decisive leader who could maintain stability in Russia while asserting its power on the world stage. But the war in Ukraine has exposed the limits of his leadership. What started as a bid to reclaim Russian influence over its former Soviet territories has turned into a quagmire that is slowly eroding his power base. The recent admissions of suffering, the growing dissent from within, and the increasing economic hardships all point to a leader who is losing his grip on power. While it's still too early to predict exactly how this will play out, one thing is clear. Putin's reign is no longer as secure as it once was. Whether through a coup, economic collapse, or a slow erosion of public support, the cracks in Putin's regime are beginning to show, and it's only a matter of time before they become too large to ignore.